cycle helps us to know how exactly the circulation of blood takes place. What are the atria? They are the upper two chambers of the heart. Joint diastole means both the upper atrial chamber and the lower ventricular chamber are in a relaxed state. Now, electrocardiograph is a machine used to obtain an electrocardiogram, which is called as the ECG. Where is the tricuspid valve present? It is present between the right atrium and between the right ventricle. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to another session on chapter 18, that is body fluids and circulation. I am Dr. Divya, Biology Faculty, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysuru, Temple of Excellence. So in the previous session of this chapter, we had discussed about various circulatory pathway in fishes, amphibians, mammals and so on. And we also learned about the circulatory pathway in a four-chambered heart, that is the human circulatory pathway. In today's session, we shall discuss about the cardiac cycle and we shall learn about an important topic, very interesting one, which is the electrocardiograph, or which is called as the ECG. So moving on to the session, we shall understand what this cardiac cycle is. So cardiac cycle helps us to know how exactly the circulation of blood takes place. So if you need to understand this, please watch the previous session wherein we talked about the cardiac, that is the circulatory pathway, because there we had discussed about the sinoatrial nodes or the atrioventricular nodes. So all that are very, very important, because here also the same concepts come, and also you need to know about the position of the tricuspid valve, the bicuspid valve, the position of the pulmonary veins, the arteries, the aorta, all that is very, very important. So please watch the previous session. So here the action potential is conducted to the ventricular side by the AVN and the AV bundle, from where the bundle of His actually transmit it through the entire ventricular musculature. So the heart is actually a muscular structure, right? So this muscular structure of the heart, especially it is in the entire ventricular musculature that the transmission or the action potential is being conducted. So we had learnt about the action potential wherein the SAN, that is SAN, or the sinoatrial nerve, that is node that is there, actually conducts the action potential, and that is very, very important for the rhythmic beating of the heart. So this action potential, it causes the ventricular muscles to contract. So what happens here? The ventricular muscles contract. So for you to easily understand, I'll show it in the form of a box. So we all know that the heart is made up of four chambers, right? So what are the four chambers? The right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And these are divided by walls, right? So we had studied about all that. But in between the right atrium and the right ventricle, there is a passage that is present. Likewise, in between the left atrium and the left ventricle also there is a passage that is present. But these passages are covered by a flap, right? So between the right atrium and the right ventricle, a tricuspid flap is present, tricuspid valve. And between the left atrium and the left ventricle, there is presence of a bicuspid valve, or it was also called as the mitral valve, bicuspid valve. Knowing all this is very, very important. So what was the point that they put here in your NCERT textbook? The AVN and the AV bundle. So what is the AVN? AVN is the atrioventricular node, right? Why it is called as the atrioventricular node? Because it is present at the junction of the atrium and the ventricle. So that is why. So this is called the atrioventricular node. Then we have the SAN, that is the sinoventricular node. It is present in the extreme right corner of the right atrium. That is sinoatrial node. So both of these are very, very important. Now what happens here is the action potential is conducted to the ventricular side. So, in the ventricular side of the heart, the action potential is conducted. So, this action potential is conducted by what? By the atrioventricular node. So, this part we have the atrioventricular node that is present. So, it conducts the atrioventricular node where the bundle of His that is present, or it is also called as the His bundle. So, that transmits the impulse that is there, or the action potential gets transmitted to the entire ventricular musculature. So, when the action potential gets transmitted to the entire ventricular musculature, what happens? It causes the ventricular muscles to contract. So, that contraction of the ventricular muscle is called as the ventricular systole. Always remember, contraction in the case of heart, it is called as systole, and relaxation is called as diastole. So, here ventricular systole is taking place. Ventricular systole is taking place means ventricular contraction occurs. And also, when the ventricular contraction occurs, the atria, that is the right atria and the left atria that they are there, they actually undergoes relaxation, that is called as diastole. So, what happens here? The impulses will be conducted, or action potential will be conducted by the atrioventricular node that is there. This will pass to the entire ventricular region, wherein it will result in the contraction of the ventricular muscles, which is called as the ventricular systole. Therefore, when the ventricular systole gets contracted, the atrial region or the atrial chamber of the heart, that is there, the right atrial and the left atrial, they undergo relaxation, they return back to the normal size, that is relaxation. Don't mean that relaxation doesn't mean that expanding, it is returning back to the normal size, and that is called as the atrial diastole, or it is called as the diastole, and this coincides with the ventricular systole. So, likewise it keeps happening when ventricular systole or ventricular contraction is occurring, the atrial diastole occurs, or the atrial relaxation occurs. So, that is how the heart actually beats, or so that is the cardiac cycle. So, what happens when such a process occurs? So, first what happens, I told you, first ventricular systole occurs, right? That is the contraction of the ventricle occurs. So, when this ventricle part of the heart contracts, or when the ventricular systole increases, or as the contraction in the ventricular systole increases, the ventricular pressure will be created. A pressure will be created in the ventricular chambers of the heart, and this pressure actually causes the closure of tricuspid valve. Where is the tricuspid valve present? It is present between the right atrium and between the right ventricle. Why are these valves very important? So that to prevent the backward flow of the blood, because the flow of the blood through the heart has to be unidirectional, wherein the oxygenated blood flows through the left atrium and the left ventricle, and the deoxygenated blood flows from the right ventricle to the right atrium. So that is how the flow has to occur, right? So if this constant unidirectional flow has to be maintained, then the valves are very necessary. So what did I tell you here? As and when the contraction in the right ventricle and the left ventricle, that is the two lower chambers of the heart, increases, it causes a pressure. A pressure gets built up in the ventricular chambers of the heart, and this pressure actually causes the closure of the tricuspid valve. So, there is a small flap-like structure or a valve that is present. This is the tricuspid valve, and here a small flap is present. This is the bicuspid valve. So, here the tricuspid as well as the bicuspid valves close in order to prevent the backward flow of the blood to the atria, so that whatever blood is flowing in unidirection, it should not flow back to the upper atrial chambers. So that is how the closure occurs. Now the blood is there in the ventricular region. Next, what happens, we shall look into. So moving on further, I'll draw the same thing here so that you can better understand. So this you should understand with this type of the heart, but for you to easy understanding, I'm drawing it in the form of a square with 4 boxes here. So what did we learn here? There is presence of right atrium, left atrium, then right ventricle, then left ventricle, And what all is there here? There is, in between the right atrium and the right ventricle, there is a passage. Similarly, between the left atrium and the left ventricle, there is a passage. And this passage is protected by a flap, so, or a cuspid. So that is called as the tricuspid valve, tricuspid valve, and this one bicuspid valve. So now, so much we had understood, and we had understood that as and when the contraction occurs in the right and the left ventricle, a pressure is being created which actually closes the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. Now, so much we have understood. Moving further, now as the ventricular pressure keeps on increasing, still the ventricular pressure is increasing. Why? Because the blood is there in the ventricular region of the heart, and that blood, filling of the blood in that ventricular part actually causes a pressure. So as the ventricular pressure increases further, the semilunar walls. Now you need to understand where is the semilunar walls present. So far we studied about only two valves, right? That is tricuspid and bicuspid. Now comes into action the semilunar valve. So the heart has two veins, which is aorta. So this vein, I'll mark it as aorta, and it has pulmonary artery. So this is pulmonary artery. These two you should know, because pulmonary artery, the oxygenated blood is carried from the pulmonary artery, and aorta also has a function in carrying the blood. So here now the semilunar valve is actually present in the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So pulmonary artery, that is towards the right side, and it is present in the aorta towards the left side. So this pulmonary artery and aorta, they are also passage for the flow of blood, right? So here also, in between wherein the pulmonary artery and the aorta is there also there is a flap-like structure that is present, which is called, this flap-like structure, it is called as the semilunar walls. Semilunar valve. So now we understood where semilunar valve are present. Semilunar valves are present in the flap that is present, or it is a valve that is present at the junction of the pulmonary artery and also at the junction of the aorta. Now what is the function of the semilunar valve? So now as and when the pressure in the ventricle, that is the right ventricle and the left ventricle, keeps on increasing, the semilunar valves, which are guarding the pulmonary artery and the aorta, they are forced to open, because if the pressure keeps on increasing, now the blood cannot be retained in the ventricles, right? It has to be let out. So the increasing pressure actually forces the semilunar valves that are there in the pulmonary artery and the aorta to open. When they open, what happens? The blood that is there in the ventricles, that is the lower chamber of the heart, the right ventricle and the left ventricle, they will start to flow through these vessels into the circulatory pathway. They'll start to flow towards the circulatory pathway. So this is what exactly happens. So what happens here? As and when the pressure in the ventricle increases, the pressure actually creates the opening of the semilunar walls that are present in the pulmonary artery and the aorta, therefore allowing the flow of the blood through these two vessels. What are the two vessels? Pulmonary artery and the aorta, to circulate to different body parts. So that to enter into the circulatory pathways. Now what happens? Now the blood has flown from the ventricles, right? That is from the right ventricle and the left ventricle, the blood has flown. Now the pressure starts to decrease in the ventricle because the blood is not there, it has flown, right? So here the ventricles will now relax, and the relaxation is called as diastole. Contraction is called as systole, relaxation is called as diastole. So when the pressure is released from the ventricles, or when the blood is released from the ventricle into the circulatory pathway, because of the opening of the semilunar walls present in the pulmonary artery and the aorta, the pressure that is created in the right and the left ventricle, they will drastically come down, causing the contraction of the ventricle, which is called as the ventricular diastole. So now ventricular diastole has occurred and the ventricular pressure falls, causing the closure of the semilunar walls. Now, as the pressure falls, what happens? The semilunar walls will close. What happens if the semilunar valve doesn't close? Whatever blood is flowing into circulatory pathway, they will just come back. So they should not come back. So if they should not come back, what happens? The semilunar valves get closed, because obviously it will get closed. Why? Because the pressure in the ventricles are decreasing. If the pressure is still increasing, then the semilunar valves will be open, but it is decreasing. So they will begin to close so that it will prevent the backward flow of blood into the ventricles. Now, still blood is flowing out of the ventricles and entering into the circulatory pathway. So, still the pressure in the ventricle keeps on decreasing. So, as the ventricular pressure declines or decreases further, the tricuspid and the bicuspid walls are pushed open by the pressure in the atria. Now, a pressure is being created in the atria because I told you, when the contraction of the ventricles are occurring, the atrias will be in a relaxed state. When the relaxation of ventricles are occurring, the atrias will be in a contracting state. So now what happens? The contraction of the atrias will occur. What are the atrias? They are the upper two chambers of the heart. When the contraction of the atrias occur, a pressure gets built up in the atrias. So that pressure will create the opening of the tricuspid valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and the bicuspid valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now, what happens when the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves open? So, here, now what happens? The blood will start to get emptied into the veins. So, different veins that are there which carries blood to different parts of the body, the blood gets emptied into the respective vein. So, that is what happens in this particular case. Now, we understood, we reached a point wherein the atrium, that is the right atrium and the left atrium, they contracted, creating a pressure. That pressure caused the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve to open. When the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve opened, the blood started to flow into the respective veins. So much we understood. Next, moving further, what happens? Now, the blood is in the atrium. It is traveling into different veins. Is there blood in the ventricles? No, it is free of blood, right? So, once it is free of blood, what happens? Again, the cycle has to continue. It is a cardiac cycle, right? So, again, the blood will fill into the ventricles. Now, what happened? The blood now once again moves freely to the ventricles, and therefore, the ventricles and the atria are now again in a relaxed state. Because atria is also having blood, ventricles are also having blood. It is not that the blood is there only in the upper chamber nor only in the lower chamber. That would have created a pressure. But now blood is there in the upper chamber as well as the lower chamber. Therefore, it is causing equal pressure in both the atria, that is ventricle. Therefore, what happens? Both of these becomes relaxed now, and it is called as the joint diastole. So, what does joint diastole means? Diastole is nothing but relaxation. Systole is nothing but contraction. So, joint diastole means both the upper atrial chamber and the lower ventricular chamber are in a relaxed state now. So, now what happens? We had spoken about sand, right? So, I'll draw this again one more time. So, I want you to keep memorizing this, because if you draw like this and learn only, you can understand this properly. So, now we had the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Passages that was present between these two, and these passages were covered by a flap, that is tricuspid flap, tricuspid valve, and then a bicuspid valve. Now what happens here? We had studied about the aorta, then the pulmonary artery or vein, and there was a flap present in these two, which was called as the semilunar flap or semilunar valve. So much we studied, and we understood that there was a, that is SAN, sinoatrial node here, and a atrioventricular node here. All the functions of the atrioventricular node we understood. That atrioventricular node was the one that actually passed the action potential to the ventricles, first causing the contraction of the ventricles. So we had learnt all that. So now we're talking about the SAN. So SAN, it is present in the right atrium, that is the right corner of the right atrium, that is which is the upper chamber of the heart. So now it is the function of the SAN. So what the SAN does is, it generates a new action potential, and the events described above, whatever events we had described, no, same thing will occur here as well. What happens again here? Contraction, relaxation, whatever had to occur, same thing. But only thing was here, instead of the atrioventricular node, it is the sinoatrial node that is actually creating the action potential, and it continues to repeat. So this sequence wherein what all sequences had occurred, that is the atrioventricular node created the impulses or action potential that caused the contraction of the right ventricle and the left ventricle, creating a pressure. That pressure caused the closure of the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve, so that the backward flow of the blood will not occur. Now the blood that is there in the right ventricle and the left ventricle, it is creating a lot of pressure. That pressure that is being created will cause the semilunar valve to open. Therefore, from the semilunar valve that is present in the aorta and the pulmonary artery to open, therefore passing on the blood into the circulatory pathway. So much we had understood, right? After that, what happened? Again, the blood will enter into the atrial region. Once the blood enter into the atrial region, a pressure builds up in the atrial region. That pressure causes the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve to open, and soon what happens when the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves open, the blood flows into the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Now both the atrium and the ventricles are having the blood, therefore a equal pressure is being created between them, which results in the relaxation of these two, which is called as joint diastole, right? So much we had understood. After that, what happens? It is the function of the sinoatrial node. So again, the sinoatrial node is the one that actually generates a new action potential. Again, that sinoatrial node creates a pressure. So the same process continues, but with the sinoatrial node. So it continues, hence it is called as a cardiac cycle. So this sequential event in the heart, which is cyclically repeated, is called as the cardiac cycle, and it consists of the systole, that is contraction of the heart, and diastole, that is relaxation of the heart, both in the atria as well as the ventricles. So much we have understood now about the cardiac cycle. So this cardiac cycle is nothing but the one that is causing the beating of the heart. We hear, right? We feel that lub-dub sound that we hear. That is nothing but beating. And we had studied that how many times in an adult human being, the average times the heartbeat is about 72 times per minute. And that many cardiac cycles will occur, means 72 times this systole and diastole process are occurring in the heart, and it is the cardiac cycle. So 72 times the cardiac cycle is occurring, and each time the cardiac cycle occurs, we can feel that beating of the heart. So that is about the cardiac cycle. So moving further, what is the duration of the cardiac cycle? Can you imagine this whole process? For me to explain now, it took so long. But can you imagine the whole process? One single cardiac cycle is about 0.8 seconds. So once a heartbeat occurs, what happens? All this contraction, relaxation, all the process, the flow of the blood, everything what I explained now, it will just occur in 0.8 seconds. So the duration of a cardiac cycle, what is that? Is 72 times the heart that beats. Each time it takes about 0.8 seconds it will last. So it is very, very fast. So during a cardiac cycle, each ventricle that is there, it pumps out approximately 70 ml of blood, and it is called as the stroke volume. So they will ask, what is the stroke volume? Stroke volume is nothing but the amount of blood, that is 70 ml of blood that the ventricle pumps during each cardiac cycle. So the stroke volume multiplied by the heart rate, that is number of beats per minute, gives the cardiac output. So number of beats per minute is 72, right? So 70 ml into 72, that actually gives the cardiac output of a particular person. So therefore, the cardiac output can be defined as the volume of blood pumped out by each ventricle per minute, and it has an average of 5000 ml or 5 liters in a healthy individual. So if you just calculate 70 into 72, so it an average of 5000 ml or 5 liters of blood is pumped out from the healthy individual, and that is called as the cardiac output. So once the heart beats 72 times, means 72 times when it beats, 5000 ml of blood is being produced. So each time the heart beats, it is 70 ml, but 72 times to put together, it is somewhere around 5000 ml or 5 liters. So this is about the cardiac cycle. Can you imagine? So such a small process gets completed in 0.8 seconds. It's quite fascinating, right? How fast and how quick a heart is working. It has to work fast. That is why we are able to be so energetic. Otherwise, what if it takes more time, we'll not be able to do our work properly, because heart is the one that supplies the oxygenated blood to different parts of our body. So we will not get enough of oxygenated blood. Our body tissues, cells will not get enough of oxygenated blood, therefore lowering up the potential of work. So that is why a heart should always be kept healthy. So this was about the cardiac cycle. So moving further, so our body has the ability to alter the stroke volume. That's true, right? It is not that every individual can produce 5000 ml of blood. It's not possible, or the ventricle cannot pump out 70 ml of blood per beat, right? It is not possible. So here what happens? Why is there variation? Sometimes when we exercise, what happens? The pumping of the blood will be more. It will vary. So for example, the cardiac output of an athlete will be much higher than that of an ordinary man, because athlete, when he is working out or when he is doing a sports activity or something, he'll take up more amount of oxygen. More amount of oxygen is needed for his body. So that time the cardiac output will increase. It will not be 70 ml per beat of the heart. So it will alter. So that is what we need to keep in mind. So each cardiac cycle, two prominent sounds are produced which can be easily heard through a stethoscope. That is true, right? We can hear that lub-dub sound that is there. So lub and dub, two prominent sounds can be heard. So counting the number of lub-dub sounds that are there, the patient's heart condition can also be detected to on a primary basis. So the first heart sound, lub, is associated with the closure of the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, whereas the second heart sound, that is dub, is associated with the closure of the semilunar valve. So why will the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve gets closed? It is because of the pressure that is being created in the right ventricle, and when the right ventricle and the left ventricle is relaxing, it results in the closure of the valve. What happens in the next semilunar wall? So semilunar walls close because of the increasing pressure tends to close. So when the closure of the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve occurs, the lub sound is heard, and when the closure of the semilunar valves occur, the dub sound is here. That is what we hear, the lub-dub sound of the heartbeat. So these sounds are of clinical diagnostic significance, because the doctor can predict by counting the number of lub-dub sounds. So how many lub-dub should be produced? Somewhere around 72, right? So that means the heart is working properly. So that sound is actually of great clinical importance, and it can be felt by placing the stethoscope in the heart region. So this is about the cardiac cycle. So now we'll learn about the electrocardiograph. So because you know about the cardiac cycle very well now, it will be easy for you to understand the electrocardiograph. So electrocardiograph, you might have seen in movies and all, know how the patients are fixed to an instrument wherein a lot of wires are coming out, few of the wires in his arms and in his leg region, then on his chest and all that, right? That is to monitor the pulse. That is, pulse is nothing but the heartbeat. So electrocardiograph is a machine used to obtain an electrocardiogram, which is called as the ECG. So electrocardiogram, so you might have noticed in the monitor, right, something like this or like this one. Some waves will be created of the heart. So peaks, as and when the peaks are increasing means the blood is flowing to different body parts. So that is how they calculated whether the heart is working properly or not. So ECG is a graphical representation of the electrical activity of the heart during a cardiac cycle. So to obtain a standard ECG, a patient is connected to the machine. Which is that machine? He is connected to the ECG machine that you can see here, and if you can see there in the diagram with 3 electrical leads. So 3 electrical leads are there, and few of the electrical leads are the chest electrode, one more electrical lead is the ankle electrode, and one more electrical lead is the wrist electrode. So 3 electrical leads are connected, one to each wrist and to the left ankle, that continuously monitors the heart activity, because that is where we find the pulse. Hold your wrist like this properly and feel yourself, quiet room. You can feel the pulse, the beating, right? So that is actually monitored. So for a detailed evaluation of the heart function, multiple leads are attached to the chest as well. So that is how, based on the beats of the heart, the graphs get created. So if you can see here, you can see how the graph, each cycle, how the heart is functioning. Based on that, the graph is created. Now let's understand how to read the graph. It is very interesting. So how can we read a standard ECG? So this is how a standard ECG looks like. So each peak in the ECG, so you can see various peaks, right? That is starting from letter P to letter T. So here a peak is being created in P, in R, then in T. So each peak that is there in the ECG, it is identified in a letter from P to T that corresponds to a specific electrical activity of the heart. How our heart beats, that will be detected in the form of electric currents, and that will be detected by the machine, and that will give the peaks like this. So what each of these peaks represent, we shall understand. So here they have given a P wave. Can you see here this P wave? So what is this P wave? So the P wave represents the electrical excitation, or represents the depolarization of the atria. Depolarization of the atria means contraction of the atria, that is systole, atrial systole. So when the contraction of the atria occurs, this curve gets formed from the machine, or in the graph this curve we will find. So what does P mean? P means it is depolarization of atria. Depolarization of atria, meaning contraction of atria. Atria is getting contracted here. So this which leads to the contraction of both the atria. Now there is a complex formed here. Can you see here? It is called as the QRS complex. What is this QRS complex? We shall look into. So the QRS complex represents the depolarization of the ventricle. What is depolarization of the ventricle? It is contraction of the ventricle. So this peak that is formed, QRS, when the ventricles contract, what happens? Blood is pushed to the different organs, right? That is what is important here. Oxygenated blood should get pushed from the heart into different body tissues. So that is very important. So that actually is represented by this complex peak that is there, Q, R and S. It represents depolarization of ventricle, meaning contraction of the ventricle. So that is nothing but ventricular contraction. So the contraction starts shortly after Q, and it marks a rise, and then again it decreases. The blood will not continuously get pumped, right? Because again the blood should fill back to the ventricle, again the process has to continue. So very slowly the contraction will occur, then a high contraction will occur, wherein with high pressure the blood is pushed out of the heart into the circulatory pathway, and then it again decreases so that the blood can get filled back so that the cycle can continue. So beginning of the systole. So therefore, and Q marks the beginning of the systole. So this is the beginning of the systole. So systole is contraction, diastole is relaxation. Remember that. So here contraction will occur, again the contraction increases and then it will start to decrease. So that is what actually happens. So here 3 graphs are being created or peaks are being created. That is why it is called as a QRS complex. Now what is P? P is the depolarization of atria. So first the contraction of atria occurs. Meanwhile, the contraction of ventricle occurs, causing the flow of the blood to the circulatory pathway. So moving further, we shall see what T is. Now, after this contraction of the atria and the systole, what happens next in the heart? So the T wave. So the T wave represents the return of the ventricles from the excited to the normal state. That is repolarization, means relaxation or diastole. We call it as relaxation or diastole. So ventricles will relax. Why it will relax? So that the blood can again get filled, so that the same process will again get repeated. So here again P, this is same thing, P, again it will get repeated like this, Q, then R, then S. Again here T, then again here P. This is how S. So this is how it continues. So this is how the standard ECG of a normal healthy person looks like. Whenever there is a variation in this curves or in the peaks here, that is when the doctors find out something is wrong with the functioning of the heart. So standard heart, this is how it will look. So what happens with T means, T waves mean, so this T wave is nothing but it is relaxation of ventricle. Relaxation of ventricle. So relaxation of ventricle is called as repolarization. Depolarization means contraction. Depolarization occurs here. This is depolarization. Depolarization of atria, here depolarization of ventricle. Both here first contraction occurs. After contraction, because the blood has to get filled back again, because the flow already took place. Flow took place and the blood is flowing to different body parts. Now the blood should again get filled back into the ventricles, right? So that actually happens in the relaxation process of the ventricle, which is represented by the T wave here. And this again continues. Now ventricle relaxes, blood gets filled in the ventricle, again a pressure gets created and the same thing will continue. So that is how the heartbeat looks like of a person. So the end of the T wave marks the end of the systole. So by counting the number of QRS complexes that occur, how many QRS complexes have been formed? Why is this QRS complex is important? Because that peak actually depicts that how much ml of blood is flowing out of the heart. How much blood is flowing out of the heart, that actually QRS complex depicts here. So it occurs in a given time period. One can determine the heartbeat or heart rate of an individual. So since ECGs obtained from different individuals have roughly the same shape for a given lead configuration, any deviation. So I told you, any healthy human being, his heartbeat should look like this itself. If any deviation occurs, say for example, any variation, maybe there is a decrease in the number of QRS peaks that is occurring in the ECG of that person, then it is understood, okay, the blood is not getting properly pumped out of the heart. He might have a blockage or something. It will be understood in that way. So therefore, any abnormality in this particular standard ECG graph actually makes the doctor understand that the person is having an abnormal heart. Some disease has happened to the heart. So that is how it is understood. So this was about the standard ECG. So I hope you understood the session well, wherein we discussed about the cardiac cycle and we also discussed about a standard ECG graph and how to read the ECG graph and all that. In the coming session, we shall deal with the double circulation process. Why it is called a double circulation? All that we shall understand in the coming session, and also we shall understand about the different diseases that can occur to the heart. So we shall meet again in the coming session. Thank you.